If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. The late afternoon sun hung low over the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, bathing the city in hues of amber and gold. Elijah Walker, a distinguished civil rights attorney, navigated his black sedan through the familiar roads of his hometown. He had just wrapped up a long day in court defending an underprivileged client in a discrimination case. The day had been draining but rewarding, a small victory in his larger fight for justice. The soft hum of classical music filled the car's cabin, offering a brief respite from the weight of his responsibilities. As he approached an intersection, the light turned yellow. He eased his foot onto the brake, rolling to a smooth stop just as it turned red. Out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights erupted behind him, accompanied by the sharp wail of a siren. Elijah's stomach tightened, though he kept his expression calm. He pulled over to the side of the road, switching off the music as he reached for his wallet. Through the rearview mirror, he saw the officer exit his cruiser, a tall man with a buzz cut and a smug air of authority. The officer adjusted his belt as he swaggered toward Elijah's window. His badge glinted in the sunlight. Officer Bradley Carter. "License and registration," Carter barked, not bothering with pleasantries. His tone carried a thinly veiled edge, one that Elijah recognized all too well. It was the tone of someone who believed they already had the upper hand. Elijah handed over his documents without a word, his movements deliberate and calm. He had no illusions about how this encounter might go. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Carter asked, his voice flat but tinged with something darker. "I'm not sure, officer," Elijah replied evenly. "Was I speeding?" "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Carter said, though his hesitation was noticeable. Elijah frowned slightly. "I thought I stopped in time, but I understand." Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his sharp eyes scanning Elijah from head to toe, as though searching for something incriminating. His posture shifted, becoming more rigid, and his gaze hardened. "You're not from around here, are you?" Carter asked, a hint of accusation in his tone. Elijah met his gaze steadily. "Actually, I was born and raised here. I've recently moved back. The address is on my license." Carter barely glanced at the license. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Elijah replied, his tone calm but firm. The tension in the air thickened. Elijah could sense Carter's growing irritation. This was no longer about a traffic violation. The officer's demeanor carried the unmistakable stench of prejudice, and Elijah knew where this was headed. Carter folded Elijah's documents slowly, tucking them into his chest pocket. "Step out of the car for me," he ordered. Elijah's grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone still polite but edged with steel. Carter smirked faintly. "Do I need one? Step out of the car." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Elijah exhaled slowly, opening the door and stepping out. He stood tall, his tailored suit and polished shoes contrasting sharply with the gritty asphalt beneath him. "Hands where I can see them," Carter ordered, gesturing toward the hood of Elijah's car. Elijah complied, moving with measured precision. "Is there something specific you are looking for, officer?" "Routine, huh?" Carter replied with a smirk. "We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting Carter's gaze. "Incidents involving men in suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch, and for a fleeting moment, Carter's composure faltered. His hand drifted toward his belt reflexively. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question," Elijah replied. There was no defiance in his tone, only an unnerving calmness that seemed to rattle Carter further. The officer leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem awfully familiar with how this works. Got something to hide?" "No, officer," Elijah said. "Just believe in transparency. You know, being clear about the reasons for interactions like this." Carter scoffed, stepping back and pacing in a small circle. His frustration was palpable. Elijah's calm, poised demeanor was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Carter muttered. "Like you know how this is going to play out." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Carter froze for half a second, his smirk vanishing. His jaw tightened as he struggled to maintain control of the interaction. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Carter snapped. "I need to check for weapons." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Weapons?" he repeated, incredulous. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" "I'm not going to ask you again," Carter growled. For a moment, Elijah considered his options. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat on the hood of his car. Carter patted him down with rough, almost aggressive movements, his hands lingering longer than necessary. "You're clean," Carter muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, as if it irritated him that he hadn't found anything. Elijah turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done—" "I'm not done," Carter interrupted, his voice rising slightly. He was grasping for control, and it was slipping through his fingers. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do," Carter said, his frustration bubbling over. "Care to explain why?" Elijah folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling in the air. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he said. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Carter stepped closer, invading Elijah's personal space. "You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" "I don't think anything, officer," Elijah replied evenly. "I just believe in fairness. And so far, I'm not seeing much of it here." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Carter's face twisted with barely concealed rage. "People like you always—" Carter stopped himself abruptly, the unspoken words lingering like smoke. "People like me?" Elijah repeated softly, his voice charged with meaning. For the first time, Carter looked uncertain. He stepped back, his confidence cracking. "That's enough," Carter snapped. "I don't care who you are." Elijah reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Carter's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics." When Elijah flipped open his wallet, the gleaming emblem of the Civil Rights Division stared back at Carter. "Elijah Walker," he said, his tone casual but firm. "Lead investigator, Civil Rights Division." Carter froze, his face draining of color as the weight of Elijah's identity hit him. This wasn't just another driver he could bully. This was someone who held the power to dismantle everything he stood for. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the humid Alabama air. Officer Carter stared at the badge in Elijah's hand, his confidence eroding with every passing second. His swagger and bravado had melted away, leaving a man who now stood exposed, not just to Elijah, but to his own conscience. "You're with the Civil Rights Division?" Carter stammered, his voice cracking as his gaze darted between the badge and Elijah's unyielding eyes. "Yes," Elijah replied, slipping the badge back into his pocket. His voice was calm but edged with steel. "And now that we've established that, Officer Carter, I'd like to know why this stop went the way it did." Carter opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. His hands twitched near his belt, as if trying to grasp for some semblance of authority, but the ground beneath him had shifted. "You escalated this situation," Elijah continued, his tone steady. "You made assumptions. And now here we are. So tell me, officer, why?" Carter took a step back, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. I don't have to answer your questions," he muttered, though the tremble in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze piercing through Carter's defensive facade. "No, you don't," he said. "But here's what's going to happen. I'll be filing a formal complaint with your department, and when this incident is reviewed, they'll find out everything, every decision you made, every assumption, every word you chose to say or not say." Carter stiffened, his jaw clenching. "You can't." "I can," Elijah interrupted, his voice cutting through Carter's protest like a scalpel. "And I will." The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his actions finally settling on him. He reached into his pocket and handed Elijah's license and registration back, his hands trembling slightly. "Here," Carter mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Elijah took the documents, his movements slow and deliberate. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. Turning back, he locked eyes with Carter one final time. "Remember this, Officer Carter," Elijah said, his voice quiet but resonating with authority. "The badge you wear doesn't give you the right to disrespect the people you serve. It holds you accountable to them. And if you don't understand that, you shouldn't be wearing it. Without waiting for a response, Elijah slid into his car and started the engine. As he drove away, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from the intensity of the encounter. He had faced moments like this before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just another incident of profiling. It was a symptom of a larger disease, one that he had spent his entire career trying to eradicate. The next morning, Elijah sat at his desk in the Civil Rights Division office, a sleek, minimalist space with walls lined with books on law and justice. The encounter with Carter replayed in his mind as he stared at the blank complaint form on his computer screen. He knew the implications of what had happened and the opportunity it presented. This wasn't just about Carter. It was about a system that allowed officers like him to operate with impunity. Elijah's fight wasn't with one man. It was with the culture that bred men like Carter. His assistant Lisa knocked on the door and entered, carrying a thick file. "Morning, Elijah," she said, her tone professional but warm. "Here's the casework you asked for. Also, Chief Harris wants to see you in his office." Elijah nodded, setting the file aside. "Thanks, Lisa. I'll head over now." As he walked down the hallway, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor, Elijah braced himself. Chief Harris was a veteran of the force, a man who had spent decades navigating the complicated intersection of law enforcement and community relations. He was respected, but cautious, a man who valued the system, but wasn't blind to its flaws. "Elijah," Harris said as he entered the office. "Take a seat." Elijah sat across from the chief, his posture straight but relaxed. "You wanted to see me?" Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "I heard about your encounter last night with Officer Carter. It's already making waves." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." "Carter reported it himself," Harris said, his tone laced with frustration. "He claims you were confrontational and tried to intimidate him by revealing your position." Elijah let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Of course he does. Did he happen to mention the part where he profiled me, escalated the situation, and violated protocol?" Harris sighed. "I've known Carter for a while. He's not a bad cop, but he's got blind spots." "Blind spots?" Elijah repeated, his voice sharp. "Chief, those blind spots are the reason people like me don't feel safe on the roads we pay taxes to maintain. They're the reason trust between law enforcement and the community is broken." Harris held up a hand, his expression placating. "I'm not defending him, Elijah, but you have to understand, change doesn't happen overnight. You know that better than anyone." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes blazing with conviction. "I do, but that doesn't mean we accept the status quo. This isn't just about Carter. It's about a culture that allows men like him to act with impunity. And I'm not letting this go." Harris regarded him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, file your report. We'll handle it through the proper channels." Elijah stood, his resolve unshaken. "Thank you, Chief, but let me be clear. If the proper channels don't lead to real change, I'll find another way." Over the next few weeks, Elijah dove headfirst into his investigation. He filed his complaint against Carter, but he didn't stop there. Using his connections in the legal and activist communities, he began gathering stories from others who had experienced similar treatment. The stories poured in. Drivers pulled over for minor infractions. Pedestrians stopped and frisked without cause. Citizens treated as suspects simply because of the color of their skin. The patterns were undeniable. This wasn't about one officer or even one department. It was a systemic issue, deeply rooted in the culture of law enforcement. Elijah's office became a hub of activity. Lisa worked tirelessly by his side, compiling data, organizing community meetings, and drafting reports. Every story they uncovered added fuel to the fire, and Elijah's resolve only grew stronger. The media began to take notice. Local news outlets ran stories on the rising tension between law enforcement and the community, highlighting Elijah's efforts to hold the system accountable. Protests erupted outside police stations, calling for transparency and reform. But with every step forward, the resistance grew stronger. Anonymous threats were left on Elijah's voicemail. His car was vandalized. And behind closed doors, powerful figures in the city's political and law enforcement circles began plotting to discredit him. Elijah's investigation was no longer just a complaint. It was a storm brewing on the horizon. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered a web of systemic corruption that implicated not just Carter, but high-ranking officials in the department. Whispers of falsified reports, evidence tampering, and unspoken quotas for stops and arrests began to paint a damning picture. The tipping point came when an unexpected ally emerged, Officer Maria Vasquez. Maria, a seasoned officer with a spotless record, had seen enough. She couldn't ignore the growing unease within her department, the hushed conversations, or the subtle yet pervasive pressure to conform to practices she knew were wrong. After watching Carter's actions and hearing about Elijah's investigation, she made a decision that would change everything. Late one evening, Maria knocked on Elijah's office door. Lisa opened it, and Maria stepped inside, her expression tense but resolute. "Elijah," she began, her voice low, "we need to talk." Elijah gestured for her to sit, noting the stress etched into her face. "What's on your mind, Officer Vasquez?" She hesitated for a moment before pulling a flash drive from her pocket. It's internal emails, directives, and evidence logs. I've been collecting them for months. It's proof of what you're looking for: systemic bias, abuse of power, and cover-ups." Elijah leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Sie, because I'm tired of being complicit," she said, her voice firm. "I became a cop to protect people, not to harass them. This department is sick, and it needs to change. If this helps you take them down, then so be it." Elijah took the flash drive, his respect for Maria evident in his gaze. "You know this puts a target on your back, right?" She nodded. "I know, but someone has to do the right thing." The evidence Maria provided was explosive. It revealed a culture of implicit bias, where officers were encouraged to target specific communities under the guise of proactive policing. The data showed patterns of excessive stops in predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, quotas for arrests, and a disturbing lack of accountability for officers who violated policy. Elijah wasted no time. He worked with Lisa and his legal team to analyze and compile the evidence into a comprehensive report. The findings were presented to Chief Harris in a tense, closed-door meeting. "This is damning," Harris admitted, his voice heavy. "If this gets out—" "It's not a matter of if, Chief," Elijah interrupted. "It's when. The community deserves to know the truth, and we have a responsibility to deliver it." Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You're going to make a lot of enemies, Elijah." "I'm not here to make friends," Elijah replied. "I'm here to make change." As the report made its way to city officials and local media, the fallout was immediate. Protests erupted across the city, with thousands demanding justice and reform. Activist groups rallied behind Elijah, using the evidence to amplify their calls for accountability. The city was on edge, and the police department found itself under intense scrutiny. Inside the department, the backlash was fierce. Officers loyal to the status quo accused Elijah of betraying the badge, while others, inspired by his courage, began to question their own complicity. Carter, who had been placed on administrative leave, found himself at the center of the controversy. His name became synonymous with the department's failures, and the pressure on him mounted. Maria's decision to come forward did not go unnoticed. Within days, she became a pariah within the department. Her colleagues ostracized her, her superiors scrutinized her every move, and anonymous threats began appearing in her locker. One evening, as she left the precinct, she noticed her car's tires slashed and a note taped to the windshield: "Snitches get stitches." But Maria refused to back down. She met with Elijah regularly, providing additional insights into the department's inner workings. Together, they worked to ensure the investigation couldn't be buried. Elijah, too, faced mounting challenges. Anonymous threats flooded his office, and his home address was leaked online. One night, he found a spray-painted message on his garage door: "Stay in your lane." Lisa urged him to take a step back, but Elijah's resolve only deepened. "If they're scared," he told her, "it means we're getting close to the truth." The city held its breath as Elijah's findings culminated in a public hearing. The mayor, city council, police chief, and community leaders gathered in a packed auditorium, with cameras broadcasting the event live. Elijah stood at the podium, his voice steady and unwavering as he presented the evidence. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," he said, his words echoing through the hall. This is about a system that has failed its citizens. It's about rebuilding trust, ensuring accountability, and creating a culture where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality. As he spoke, Maria sat in the audience, her head held high despite the risk she had taken. Carter, on the other hand, sat with his head bowed, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. The hearing ended with a unanimous decision to overhaul the department's policies. Mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and community engagement programs were implemented. Carter was formally terminated, and several high-ranking officials implicated in the corruption resigned. In the months that followed, the city began to heal. The reforms, though met with resistance from some, marked a turning point. Maria was reassigned to a community outreach unit where she worked to rebuild trust between the police and the neighborhoods they served. Elijah continued his work, using the momentum from the investigation to push for broader reforms at the state level. His name became synonymous with accountability and justice, a beacon of hope for those who had long felt silenced. One evening, as Elijah walked through the streets of the city he had fought so hard to protect, a young boy ran up to him. "Are you Mr. Elijah?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Elijah smiled. "That's me." "My mom says you're a hero," the boy said. "She says you made it safe for us." Elijah crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "You and your mom are the real heroes," he said. "You never gave up on this city, and neither will I." A new beginning. As the sun set over the city, Elijah stood on the steps of the courthouse watching the skyline. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be challenged. But for the first time, he felt hope. Change had begun, and he was ready to see it through. Elijah's story wasn't just one of justice. It was a reminder that even in the face of systemic failure, courage and determination could ignite a revolution. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.